From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons.
The Treasury Secretary search continues. Today, Donald Trump has yet to pick a nominee amid infighting over the job, with some of his advisors now signaling support for former Federal Reserve Governor Kevin Warsh.
Trump did tap new heads for the Energy Department and FCC over the weekend, but Senate confirmation for some of his more controversial picks remains in question. We'll have more with Jessica Taylor of the Cook Political Report.
And we'll be joined by former U.S. Ambassador to China, Max Baucus, with President Biden at the G-20 summit in Brazil now, following Saturday's meeting with China's Xi Jinping in Peru. Yes, Joe Biden is still the president of the United States, though, Kaylee, he didn't seem to make the family photo today at the G20, winding things down. It's his last G20, something to consider today.
And will not have the photograph to commemorate it, but of course he attends his final summit as the leader of the free world with a message. This is what he said earlier this morning.
You know, this is my last G20 summit. We've made progress together, but I urge you to keep going. I'm sure you will, regardless of my urging or not.
And joining us now from the G20 in Rio de Janeiro is Bloomberg's David Gura, who is traveling with the president. David, thank you for joining us this evening here on Balance of Power as the sun sets in Rio. What is the mission here for Joe Biden? It's clearly about more than a photo opportunity because he didn't make the family photo. What's he looking to produce here in terms of deliverables?
I will add briefly, I think they're going to try to retake that photograph at dinner time, so there will be some memento for these leaders to have when they depart from Rio. But I think that his mission here is twofold. One is to reflect on and kind of convey to these other leaders what his legacy is or what he thinks it should be. And we saw the beginning of that while he was at the APEC summit in Peru, in that bilateral that he had with Xi Jinping, the president of China, talking about how that relationship has improved under his leadership in the White House. I think he's making the case on that issue and a number of others to world leaders here whom he's meeting with on the sidelines of the summit. The other is just to lay foundation on a number of these policy points for there to be some continuity between the Biden administration and the Trump administration. And there was a line that stood out to me from comments that President Biden made yesterday when he was in the rainforest in the central part of Brazil. He said he wanted to lay a foundation for climate change that the next president could have if he so chose to have it. And I think that that's the open question here that he's wrestling with, other leaders are wrestling with as well. He can do all of this work on climate, on sustainability, on the war in Ukraine, but he knows, everyone knows, that come January 20th, there's going to be a new person in the White House, a new old person, somebody folks here are familiar with, and it stands that policy is going to change markedly when Donald Trump is back in power.
All right, Bloomberg's David Gura live in Rio for us this evening. Thank you so much. Now, as David mentions, the transition from President Biden to incoming President Trump is underway and continues, though the president-elect has yet to settle on a nominee for Treasury Secretary amid infighting over the role. Earlier today on Bloomberg Surveillance, Kyle Bass, the CIO and founder of Heyman Capital Management, made the case for one of the contenders, Scott Bessent.
Global central bankers around the world have respect for Bessent and his views. Scott looks at the world, with a 4D chess overlay, meaning he understands geopolitics, he understands people, he understands exactly what investment flows and economic flows matter and don't matter.
Joining us now for more is Bloomberg's Mike Dorning. So, Mike, our latest reporting indicates that actually we could be looking at a pairing here where Bessent is involved, but as chair of the National Economic Council, and potentially Kevin Warsh could come in, the former Federal Reserve Governor, as Treasury Secretary. Why is this so hard to figure out?
Well, the Treasury Secretary is going to be a key job in the Trump administration. You have these conflicts within his constituencies between the populist, pro-tariff approach and the more traditional Republican tax-cutting approach. And the Treasury Secretary is going to be front and center in this, as will, in fact, the NEC director.
With that said, we have some positions that we're already heading for potential confirmation hearings. The one that's getting the most talk is Matt Gaetz, the congressman from Florida, now former congressman. And there's a big question right now, Mike, about whether the results of an ethics committee investigation should be released. The House Ethics Committee is, in fact, set to meet Wednesday amid calls to release their findings on sexual misconduct allegations against the former congressman. And we heard from the Speaker of the House over the weekend on this. He doesn't think it should be made public. Here's Mike Johnson.
We don't issue investigations and ethics reports on people who are not members of Congress. I'm afraid that would open a Pandora's box because the jurisdiction of the Ethics Committee is limited to those who are serving in the institution. That's its very purpose. And I think this would be a breach of protocol that could be dangerous for us going forward in the future.
A lot of members seem to agree, with the exception of the chair of the Ethics Committee, who says, Michael Guest, he's going to put this out if that's what the committee decides, regardless of Speaker Johnson. Will this set a new precedent in the House?
Well, it's not going to be either way that much of a precedent per se, because Gaetz was in the House until just before the ethics report was going to be released. He basically quit the 2 days before the committee here, the scheduled meeting where they were going to release this. There's a sort of a bigger issue here for a lot of Republican senators in particular, as well as Democratic senators, which is you want to look at the people that you're appointing to sensitive national security roles. It's like a separate issue from individual members of Congress, and you want to know stuff that's out there about them. So they argue, we should see the results of this, and these are some rather salacious allegations and ones that would be pertinent to a chief law enforcement officer, and ones that, you might not want to have, like sitting in a report that 8 people already have access to, and God knows how many others that then can go somewhere else.
If it's not released formally, a lot of people think it'll be leaked. Bloomberg's Mike Dorning, thank you. We'll keep tabs on this for you, of course, as over the weekend we did learn about some others, including Donald Trump's pick for Energy Secretary. Chris Wright, CEO of Liberty Energy, a strong supporter of fracking. Joining us now for more on that, Bloomberg's Texas Bureau Chief Julie Fine. So, Julie, assuming that he is confirmed, is it drill, baby, drill? Because there are great questions about what the future energy policy would look like for Donald Trump and what portions of the IRA could be rolled back.
Well, let's begin with the fact that he owns a fracking services company. So certainly deregulation will likely be rolled back. That is something that President Trump has said over and over again. He's talked about fracking throughout the campaign. And again, he won. He won with all of the swing states and he won with the popular vote. So clearly this message resonated with everybody that voted for him. So I expect to see some major policies rolled back. Now, also, you have to remember here that Wright's company actually published a paper saying that climate change is not real. That is something that will come up with the Senate. But as you just discussed about Matt Gaetz, the Senate is going to be preparing for a lot of confirmations. Some of them will be very difficult to get through. I don't think Chris Wright right now is at the top of that list.
Well, Julie, as you talk about what people voted for here, they also voted on the issue of immigration, something that Donald Trump campaigned heavily on. And he confirmed today some reporting we had seen earlier that he would declare a national emergency and use military assets for his mass deportation program. How easily can he make that a reality?
Well, what he can do is executive orders, and I expect to see those very quickly after the inauguration. Again, as you just said, and we have discussed, this is what he was elected on. However, actually getting that done will take congressional help. It will also take getting the military, if he really uses them as he says. You can't just do that overnight. So I expect there to be executive actions. I expect Congress to begin to prepare for it if this does happen. However, it will take some time. What you can really expect is what he talked about with starting with criminal deportations. We have said they will look for people with criminal records. I expect that to happen first.
All right, Bloomberg's Texas Bureau Chief Julie Fine, thank you so much. Coming up, we'll take a closer look at the coming confirmation fights over Donald Trump's nominees with Jessica Taylor. She is Senate and Governor's editor at the Cook Political Report, and she's joining us next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I think they would like it to be public for many different reasons, but I think we need to know, like, what is in there? I mean, obviously, Justice Department dropped their investigation. What did the Ethics Committee find?
Sarah Chamberlain of the Republican Main Street Partnership on the earlier edition of Balance of Power here on Bloomberg TV and radio, discussing the House Ethics Committee's investigation into now former Congressman Matt Gaetz, who Donald Trump has appointed to be Attorney General. His ability to be confirmed by the Senate is very much in question. So joining us now for more on that is Jessica Taylor. She is Senate and Governor's editor for the Cook Political Report. Jessica, welcome back to Bloomberg. As we consider not just the question of Matt Gaetz, but some of the other more controversial nominees that this new Senate and the newly elected incoming Senate majority are going to have to be grappling with, how many senators do you think confidently will be willing to vote against the president-elect on something like this without fearing for what it could mean for themselves if they're facing re-election fights in the years to come?
Yeah, for me, I look at first, so Republicans would have to have 4 senators that would vote against this. The top suspects, I would say, are Lisa Murkowski of Alaska and Susan Collins, sort of known as the more moderates of the Senate. Now, Collins is up for re-election, of course, in 2026, but she's the only Republican running in 2026 in a state Kamala Harris carried. She managed to sort of defy the electoral trends when she won in 2020. But again, she has probably more problem from the left than she would have to worry about a primary challenge, I think, at this point. And Murkowski sort of always marched to the beat of her own drum. She's not up for re-election again until 2028. And then I kind of look at possible retirements and people who might buck the president. And Mitch McConnell is atop that list, actually. He's no longer the Senate Majority Leader. He stepped down from leadership, and it's widely expected that he probably won't run again in 2026. So he sort of might be more unencumbered. So then I look at where the next possible people could be. Is it someone like Bill Cassidy, who is up in 2026, but he's a possible retirement watch? He voted to impeach Trump. Is it someone like Todd Young of Indiana that's also sort of gone against MAGA at times? Or maybe it's someone that was just elected, like John Curtis from Utah. Does he kind of remain in that sort of more moderate lane like his predecessor Mitt Romney did?
Well, while we're naming names and counting votes here, Jessica, this is fascinating to think about the way this could go. There's a broader question about whether we should be taking Donald Trump literally, if I can use that phrase, when it comes to all of these nominations. If Matt Gaetz is somehow a sacrificial play or a negotiating ploy. We've been hearing more and more over the past couple of days that no, he expects John Thune and Donald Trump Jr. reinforced this message on Sunday morning television, that they are expected to pass, to confirm all of these names. What's your thought on that as we continue to fill out the cabinet here?
I mean, we typically see that there's at least one nominee for any president, that there's things in their background or different things that come up. And Matt Gaetz is obviously the one that comes up the most with, you were talking about just before this, with the House Ethics Committee investigation. I mean, there's questions very much about allegations of sexual misconduct and different things. And then, of course, there are with Pete Hegseth, too, allegations with him for a Secretary of Defense. So all of these things do come up in a confirmation hearing where the minority party can call witnesses. And when you have someone like Matt Gaetz that hasn't done a lot to make friends even on his side of the aisle, I think that's just where the difficulties come, that there is probably just a limit to trying to get some of these people through.
Well, they might have more success with someone like, say, current Senator Marco Rubio, who has been tapped for Secretary of State, of course, is expected to resign to take up those duties, assuming that he is confirmed. We heard from Florida's Governor Ron DeSantis about the replacement for Rubio today. He said he wants to have someone named by the beginning of January, described someone as who will help Trump deliver on his election mandate, be strong on immigration and border security, take on the entrenched bureaucracy, has a proven record of results, he also said. Jessica, do you have an idea of who actually could be keeping this seat warm for the next 2 years?
Yeah, I don't expect Rubio to face backlash. In fact, I expect that he would actually probably get several Democratic votes as well. He's very much sort of an establishment type pick that we would see from any there. You know, the question is this a seat that Ron DeSantis wants to run for himself in 2026 when he's term limited? Does he appoint someone like his chief of staff, James Utheimer, there to fill the seat temporarily when he could run again? Now, we saw Charlie Crist sort of try this and then was sort of foiled by Rubio himself by winning that primary and Chris having to run as an independent and then losing. So we've seen this play out before. I would look to the lieutenant governor there, Jeanette Nahmias, too, and the attorney general, Ashley Moody, are also mentioned. They are also in the mix for, again, we have an open gubernatorial race in 2026 as well, but that would be a part of a consideration. And then, of course, the name that's getting all of the, push is Laura Trump there. That you already have, Alabama Senator Katie Britt coming out and saying that she would back her, with sort of the enemies that DeSantis made when he primaried Trump. Picking a Trump to fill this seat could go a long way, but then that could foil any potential plans that DeSantis might wonder about running for the seat himself when he's out of a job in 2 years.
Yeah, boy, there's a lot there. I'm going to ask you about Pennsylvania as well. It's going to a recount. Jessica, David McCormick is already in Washington. How much time will this take, and what should we expect to come out of this process? Is there a chance that this changes the outcome?
Well, I think what they're wrangling over now is, is a decision of whether ballots that don't have the date written correctly could count. That's what Casey's team is pushing for. The state Supreme Court just emphasized that they cannot. Well, we'll see if they appeal that further in different things. But, these types of typical recounts, if we don't see them change, I think the number of votes, it comes down to these provisional ballots and ballots that are whether they can be counted that would have enough of a change. I think it's still very, very hard for Casey to overcome this. And, David McCormick is the senator-elect at this point as we see it. Can stranger things happen? Yes. And Democrats continue to say they still see a path. But McCormick is here, as you said, in Washington, sort of going through that orientation as well. And, by the Associated Press count and other news organizations, that it is officially 4 seats that Republicans have flipped to give them that 53-47 majority that we're anticipating in the next Congress.
Mm-hmm.
So that will be the majority, at least until 2026. But I want to ask you about an election that takes place before then as well, Jessica. Next year, the New Jersey gubernatorial race is a field that is getting more crowded. We learned today that Congresswoman Democrat Mikey Sherrill is jumping into the race after the Congressman Josh Gottheimer announced he would as well just last week. I believe there's 4 other Democrats in the running. There's at least 4 Republicans as well. How much more crowded is this field going to get?
That's a very good question. I think, we see this is when we see these candidates sort of make their moves. And really, this is kind of a free primary to run in. Normally, if you're running for governor, you would have to step down from your seat. You don't have to do that in this instance since it's an off year election. So they're kind of given a little bit of a free pass. And, that's a seat that Democrats have held, an open seat there that Republicans, again, Trump had a much smaller, he came closer in New Jersey than anyone expected. So Republicans are seeing a little bit of optimism there. But we typically see that these off-year elections, especially after a presidential year, are more of a backlash to the incumbent president's party. Not only does New Jersey have a governor's race next year, but Virginia does as well, where Glenn Youngkin is term limited there. The governor can only serve 1 consecutive term. So you have Democrat Abigail Spanberger, who just left Congress in order to run. She wanted to focus on her race for governor. And then we also had today that the Republican Attorney General Jason Miara said that he is going to run for re-election to his seat. So that clears the way for the Lieutenant Governor Winsome Sears to be it looks like she, as of now, is largely unopposed in the Republican primary. So that would be historic in Virginia to have a woman versus a woman for the seat in a state that's never elected a female governor. And Winsome Sears there, if she wins, she would be the first Black woman elected governor as well.
All right, Jessica Taylor, Senate and Governor's editor of the Cook Political Report. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, we do have some breaking news we want to mention. The headline just crossing the Bloomberg terminal. According to Bloomberg reporting, citing people familiar with the plans, the Justice Department will ask a judge to force Alphabet's Google to sell off its Chrome browser. Remember, this is after a ruling in August that found Google illegally monopolized the search market. We were waiting for a recommendation from the prosecutors as to what exactly would rectify that. Now, Justice Department antitrust officials have asked a judge to force Google to sell off its Chrome browser. And we are seeing Alphabet shares take a leg lower in the after-hours trade, down about 1%, Joe.
Bringing back memories of Microsoft. Coming up, New York's MTA earlier today approving a revised congestion pricing plan for Manhattan. It's back on. The president-elect has threatened to terminate this once he takes office, and we'll take a closer look next on how versions of it have fared in other cities around the world. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. New York City today approved a revised $9 congestion toll, becoming the first in the U.S. to implement congestion pricing. It's a move that follows a similar model used in places like London, Stockholm, and Singapore, and is meant to ease traffic, improve air quality, and fund public transportation projects, though it has faced pushback. Here with more is Bloomberg's Laura Nahmias. So, Laura, we know that the pushback comes from those like the president-elect Donald Trump. Is this going to stick around?
It remains to be seen what, if anything, President Trump will be able to do to stop it if the federal government under the outgoing Biden administration gives the final federal approvals needed for the plan to move forward with a start date right now of January 5th, 2025.
So, Laura, what have we learned in other cities, as Kayleigh mentioned, around the world that have tried this? Has it actually worked? Did it lower traffic?
Right. So at least 3 other cities have tried this. Singapore has had a version of it since the 1970s, Stockholm since 2007. And for our purposes, the closest analog is London, which has had some form of a congestion pricing program since about 2003. And experts say that the programs have worked in multiple ways. They have lowered congestion. They have raised more money for mass transit. They have led to better emissions levels. However, London has seen congestion tick up in recent years after the program initially worked very well, in part because of the rise of ride-hail vehicles like Uber and Lyft. There's just more cars on the road in London, and traffic officials there, government officials, have taken pains to tinker with the pricing levels to see if that could have an impact in lowering the congestion in London.
Laura, we only have about 30 seconds left, but what should we make of the ultimate timing here? Hochul paused this months ago, and now they get a vote on it after the election's over?
She insisted at the time that she paused it back in June that it had nothing to do with politics. However, reporting at the time suggested that she was concerned about the impact on the upcoming midterm elections. Those are over, and she did pretty well, especially compared to other states in terms of Democrats regaining House seats. And so now it appears she feels confident that she can restart the program with a slightly lower toll level.
Laura, thank you. At least it's not $15, I guess. Bloomberg's Laura Nahmias in New York. Coming up, President Biden meeting with Chinese President Xi over the weekend in Peru before both leaders went to Brazil for the G-20 summit. We'll talk about China's approach to the upcoming Trump administration next with Max Baucus, the former U.S. ambassador to China, on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
We haven't always agreed, but our conversations have always been candid and always been frank. We have never kidded one another. We've been level with one another. And I think that's vital. These conversations prevent miscalculations, and they ensure the competition between our two countries will not veer into conflict. Competition, not conflict.
President Biden speaking at a joint meeting with China's Xi in Peru over the weekend, speaking to the relationship between the two superpowers. Joining us now for a closer look and a look ahead of the next administration is Max Baucus, the former U.S. ambassador to China, of course, former U.S. senator from Montana. Mr. Ambassador, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. Apparently, Donald Trump made up a pretty good portion of the conversation between these two men. President Xi said that our two countries should not fight a new Cold War, as he called it, and he reiterated China's 4 red lines. How does that inform, in your opinion, the relationship between Xi and Trump as they get ready to work together again?
Well, it was a good opportunity for President Xi to say to President Trump and to the world that President Xi, basically wants to maintain current China policy toward the United States. And that I'm here in Hangzhou. I'm in China right now. And I can tell you that I've heard that repeated many, many times here. The Chinese do want to work with the United States. The four red lines is important. That's raised. It's important that each side made its major points to each other. But the main point here is that the Chinese are ready to deal with the United States, and what the relationship very much depends upon how well it depends on what Trump does with respect to the United States.
Well, so I am curious, Ambassador, what you're hearing in regard to the potential tariff policy that this incoming president could pursue when it comes to China, knowing, of course, he already implemented a series of tariffs during his first administration. He is talking about a much larger in scope and scale tariff regime this time around, potentially, according to at least our economists here at Bloomberg Economics, the kind of scale that could mean these two economies decouple entirely. How does China prepare for that?
China's concerned. China is very sober, very realistic about potential 60% tariff or across-the-board tariff. All countries, 10 to 20%. Concerned there could be more export controls. They're quite concerned. They're not naive at all. And I must say that the tone of the officials I talked with in the last couple of days is, as I said, sober, but it's also realistic. They're the adults in the room. They're not histrionic. They're not threatening. It's very, very, very solid. Now, basically, China, as I said, hopes that they continue working with the United States, as has been the case in the last several years. I mean, if Kamala Harris had been elected, it would have been pretty much business as usual. But with Trump, they just don't know, but they're ready. One final point here is that if they're ready to go their own way, if Trump's tariffs are too high, if there are too many adverse actions from their perspective by Trump against China.
You know, it's interesting. There's a push and pull here, Ambassador, when it comes to Donald Trump's views on China. As we've reported, he has questioned just about how much support the U.S. should provide Taiwan when it comes to its independence. Elon Musk has talked about the importance of the Chinese market for his company, Tesla. He has also said Taiwan is an integral part of China, which didn't go over very well on the island. I guess I'm just curious, how much maneuverability is there within the Trump sphere when it comes to China? We talk about across-the-board tariffs, but is it more complicated than that?
I think it's quite complicated, and frankly, I think the news is better than not. Rubio basically is a hawk against China, and certainly with respect to Taiwan. But Trump likes to do deals. And we know he's talking about a potential deal with Ukraine, who knows with whom else. But I think with respect to Taiwan, you're going to see that Trump want to maintain the status quo. In the campaign, he talks about, oh, you Taiwanese, you got to pay much. You're free riders. You got to pay a lot more for the arms that we're sending you. I don't know how far that's going to go, but I do think that Trump's going to look for a way to deal with China and try to find some accommodation on Taiwan, just as China is going to look to try to find an accommodation with Trump.
Well, as we discuss paying for things here, sir, I apologize for interrupting you. Donald Trump also argues in part that all of the tax cuts he would like to implement during his administration will be paid for in part by tariffs. That'll offset the hit to the Treasury's revenue intake. You used to chair the Finance Committee in the Senate. To what extent does that math actually work?
Well, that's a point I've made many, many times to the Chinese. I explained to them that Trump likes tariffs because Trump thinks, although most economists think this is wrong, Trump likes to think that tariffs will actually create more jobs in the United States. But he also thinks that tariffs will raise a lot of revenue and use that revenue to pay for the tax cuts that expire at the end of next year. Now, I don't know how that's going to play out. Basically, the Republican Party in our country is going to have to figure out what the number is. By number, I mean how much debt can the Republicans stomach as they work to cut taxes. But I don't know. I don't think the increase in tariff revenue is going to be that much of a play with respect to how the Congress decides what to do about tax cuts.
That's really interesting. I want to ask you about what's happening in Ukraine, Mr. Ambassador, by way of China and the way that Xi Jinping is viewing this. We talked on the early edition of Balance of Power with Jane Harman, who chairs the National Defense Strategy Commission, and her comments about Joe Biden's decision to allow Ukraine to strike Russia with these long-range ATACMS missiles that they've been asking to use for months and months. Here's what she said.
Not only were these weapons in Europe, but they should have been transferred long ago. I would hope that Ukraine will also attack military targets. Let's understand what's going on as winter descends on the region. The Russians, in the cruelest act, are trying to take out the energy grid in Ukraine and a lot of civilian facilities. They're attacking Ukrainian cities. They're not just attacking the Ukrainian military. How is this going to end well?
Ambassador, what kind of an impression is this making on Xi Jinping, who's watching his friend Vladimir Putin experience this?
Well, I think there's beginning to be a feeling generally in Europe. I think maybe the United States and also in China, there has to be a resolution of Ukraine. I heard several people here in China say, gee, maybe there could be a resolution similar to Korea. That is, finally, we just take the lines as they now are, and there'll be as with North Korea and South Korea, there could be a Russia and Ukraine. I don't know. But you do hear some talk about that now. It's clear the Chinese are a little upset, frankly, with the 10,000 North Korean troops in Ukraine, and with the long-range missiles that are there too. China has a hard time dealing, frankly, with North Korea, with Kim Jong-un. I can remember in a meeting I attended with President Xi, this is a few years ago, and President Obama. President Xi said, well, I can't deal with that young guy. I don't know how to handle him. Kim Jong-un gets under Xi Jinping's skin. But I think my overall sense, listening to Jane Harman, she asked, how's this going to end? I think a lot of people are starting to think we got to figure out how we end this thing. And this thing so we're not always continually sending more missiles, more troops. There's got to be a non-military solution of some kind.
All right, sir, thank you so much for joining us. Max Baucus, former U.S. ambassador to China and former Montana senator, joining us very early in the morning in China. We appreciate your time. Coming up, the jockeying to be Donald Trump's Treasury Secretary continues. We'll have more on the cabinet selection drama with our signature political panel next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Of course, the name that's getting all of the, push is Laura Trump there. That you already have, Alabama Senator Katie Britt coming out and saying that she would back her. With sort of the enemies that DeSantis made when he primaried Trump, picking a Trump to fill this seat could go a long way, but then that could foil any potential plans that DeSantis might wonder about running for the seat himself when he's out of a job.
Jessica Taylor of the Cook Political Report earlier this hour on who might replace Florida Senator Marco Rubio should his nomination for Secretary of State go through. He, of course, is one of those likely to get Senate confirmation. But some of Donald Trump's other cabinet elections have raised some major eyebrows and questions about their ability to get through the upper chamber. So joining us now with more here on Bloomberg TV and radio is our signature political panel. Rick Davis, Stone Court Capital Partner, is back, and Jeannie Shanzano, political science professor at Iona University and senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. Welcome to you both. Happy Monday. Of course, as I say, Rubio does seem like one of the safer choices. Matt Gaetz, Rick, might be a little harder to get over the finish line. Axios literally just running a story that says Trump has personally pressured senators to confirm Gaetz. That would be an indication maybe that he does really want this to happen. I guess the question is, will his pressure be enough if that ethics committee report actually sees the light of day?
Yeah, look, obviously Donald Trump knew that by putting Matt Gaetz out there for Attorney General was going to ruffle some feathers, especially within the Republican caucus, not because of anything Donald Trump has done, but like Matt Gaetz has been a thorn in everybody's side, not just Democrats. And so he knew all that stuff going in. And it doesn't surprise me that he is going to twist arms and cajole as many senators as he can to try and get that nomination through. It's going to be hard work. And from what I can tell, there's mounting opposition in the Republican caucus to this idea of a recess appointment. So two of those things, are mutually exclusive. I don't know how Matt Gaetz gets through that Senate confirmation without a recess appointment. And maybe he just chooses to fight that another day. But I think this one's going to be tough. And by the way, I don't think it's the only one that's going to be tough. I think Tulsi Gabbard is going to be tough, and Pete Hegseth is going to be tough. So there's a fight coming ahead within the Republican caucus.
A pressure cooker campaign, it sounds like, Jeannie, just to deal with Matt Gaetz alone. Whether this report is released formally by the House Ethics Committee, whether it's leaked, or whether people start watching the news, the lawyer for the two women who testified to the Ethics Committee about Representative Matt Gaetz, who told a story that I can't repeat on the air here, he's going to be hard to miss in the coming days and weeks. Is that how this ends, or is Donald Trump, in fact, daring John Thune to confirm Matt Gaetz either way?
Yeah, I mean, Donald Trump has said that this is the most important appointment he has made, is Matt Gaetz. I mean, this is how badly he wants to blow up, and I'm putting that in quotes, the DOJ. And so, you know, all of these other allegations be damned, he has said that this is, you know, sort of his North Star. And so how he is going to get this done is the big question. And to Rick's point, there's a few nominees here that are controversial. He didn't mention also RFK Jr. And so you add that up, and one of the questions is, who is going to be the sacrificial nominee here? If, you know, Republicans can't say no to all of them, who goes down? Well, if Matt Gaetz is Donald Trump's most important, and if he is able to go through, who does that leave? By some bets, people are saying it may be Tulsi Gabbard who goes down, but it's a hard call. And of course, a lot's going to depend on what the Ethics Committee in the House decides Wednesday when they meet about releasing this report. Either way, an FBI background check should get the same information, though, to the senators on the Judiciary Committee.
Well, interesting to consider the prospect of Matt Gaetz being the most important nominee here, Rick, when this is a president-elect who campaigned and was elected on issues like the economy, and he has yet to outline his economic team for us. We are still at this hour awaiting his selection for Treasury Secretary. Bloomberg now reporting Howard Lutnick is out. Perhaps he took it a bridge too far. It could be Kevin Warsh with Scott Bessent as the NEC director, but this process is playing out very publicly, and I wonder if that means it will take longer to actually resolve.
You know, look, I mean, this is obviously a key job within the Trump administration. So many of his policies, you know, whether it's on tax cuts or tariffs, and even a lot of the impact of his policies related to immigration are all part of sort of the Treasury Department portfolio. So I can see how they're going to want to get this right. And look, I mean, you know, you give advice to people who are like, you know, hoping to become a cabinet member saying, whatever you do, don't campaign it. And I think this is a classic example of nobody should have been campaigning this, right? One, because it puts the president, you know, elect in a very difficult position. And Donald Trump's not one who's going to be in a difficult position. So he's now cast that widely and said, you all are on a difficult position. I do think that to watch this NEC appointment, because Donald Trump is very White House centric, right? And so if there's going to be an economic czar, it's going to be who runs the NEC. And because there are so many of these things like trade and the economy and taxes that are going to be all under White House supervision. It's their top priority. And I think that person could ultimately be more important in the Trump administration than even a Treasury
Makes
Secretary.
a lot of sense. So Scott Bessent should take it as a compliment. It sounds like, Jeannie, knowing that Robert Lighthizer is out, it seems, as Treasury Secretary, based on the New York Times reporting that he was too pro-tariff for the stock market, does that give us a sense that tariff maybe is not Donald Trump's favorite word when it comes to Wall Street?
Yeah, I mean, I've been thinking that the reality is that Donald Trump wants somebody who may not exist, and that's somebody who Wall Street is going to cheer and applaud and feel comforted by and feel a sense of stability, and somebody who is also going to sell these massive tariffs, which few economists have been willing to do. And so I've almost like pictured Donald Trump sitting there trying to put these pieces together, and who can fit that bill? They're almost irreconcilable, those two do two tracks. And so I think he's going to try to find somebody who can convince him in some of these interviews and meetings that they can do both at the same time. And that's what makes this so tough. And I think so far the people who have been at the top of his list have, checked one box, but been unable to check the other. And who do you think of that comes to that? I don't know that there's somebody easily who can fit that bill. And I think that's why this is stretching on and on.
All right, coming up with Rick and Jeannie, President Biden's final G20. Our signature panel weighs in on the influence of the president among other world leaders next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
We all have to work to end the conflicts and crises that are eroding progress and food security around the world. This group has within its power to usher in a new era of sustainable development, to go from billions to trillions in assistance of those who most in need. This all may sound lofty, but this group can lay the foundation to make that achievable.
President Biden delivering remarks at his final G20 summit earlier today in Brazil. Back with us, our signature political panel, Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano. Great to have both of you with us. Jeannie, I've seen more tape of Joe Biden walking through the Amazon rainforest than I have any substantial policy ideas or deliverables that might come from this gathering. Is this a farewell tour, or is there more to it than that?
Yeah, I suppose if you go out, you want to go out in Rio, and the president is doing that. When somebody showed me that video, Joe, I honestly thought it was a fake. I hope the president has been found and he is successfully where he should be, because it looked like he was wandering through the rainforest. I think for the president, this is a farewell, and so much of the world, however, seems to have already, in my view at least, said goodbye and to be focused on what's coming next, which is Donald Trump, what we do about Ukraine, what we do about the Middle East. And you already see, I have been really watching the president of Argentina, who actually went to Mar-a-Lago to express his congratulations and then came back to the G20. And he's a bit of a showman. He has made some decisions for Argentina, like COP29. So, it's going to be interesting to see how they all respond. But I think that's where much of the energy is at this point, is about moving forward.
Well, Rick, as Jeannie says, she hopes someone got the president to where he was supposed to be. He was not, in fact, where he was supposed to be this afternoon when the family photo of the G20 was taking place, nor was Justin Trudeau or the Prime Minister of Italy, Giorgia Meloni, all missed the picture. It's like he already is out of the picture, Rick, as he has 2 months left in office. So how legacy defining from a foreign policy perspective is this trip really going to be?
I love that. What a metaphor. Out of the picture, literally. Look, I don't think it sets back anything. This is really just a final visit by a lame duck president. Nobody's taking it too seriously. I think, all these folks meeting with them are going to hear the same thing that any president would tell them about the fact that, we as a nation want peace. We want to be able to help those who can't help themselves. I think it's a positive message to send out from a guy who's had a stellar political history. But he really did reinvent the concept of being a tree hugger by trying to walk into the Amazon forest and actually hug a tree.
I still want to know what was going on there. We've got breaking news. How about we fill in a blank, Kaylee Lines, Transportation Secretary?
Yeah, the former Congressman Sean Duffy of Wisconsin has been tapped by Trump to lead the Transportation Department, according to a post just now on his True Social page. So we put another one down.
Another reality TV star.
Yes, exactly.
Interesting.
Not just a former congressman.
That's correct. And boy, camera ready, central casting, as we've heard repeatedly, is important to the president-elect. Jeannie, is this a layup with some of the other names we've already talked about?
In comparison, Sean Duffy is a layup. And yes, I am old enough to remember him on MTV with his wife, who he met there on reality TV. And then he became a congressman and obviously a Fox News star, as his wife is as well. So I think this one is probably a layup in comparison to the four that are more questionable.
Well, and we still have a few other blanks to fill in, Rick. Do you think all the controversial ones are behind us? He's sandwiching them between more easy to confirm picks?
Oh, I would assume nothing. But this does represent another congressional race that has to be defended in a special election. So we're racking up quite a political season, for specials. And Wisconsin is always a state that you're really not sure how it's going to turn out. So that may be one of the more competitive ones. But the bottom line is, I don't think we've seen at all the end of Donald Trump's efforts to sort of dismantle the establishment in Washington, D.C. And that is, after all, the people who he's appointed are committed to that.
All right, Rick Davis and Jeannie Shan Zaino, thank you so much joining us as we deal with this breaking news. Former Congressman Sean Duffy tapped for Transportation Secretary. I guess we'll wait and see if we get more tomorrow.
Yeah, wait for Education Secretary. There's still a chance for some controversy. We'll see you tomorrow on Balance of Power here on Bloomberg TV and Radio.